Hello everyone and welcome. This is Claire Bradovich, Program and Learning Coordinator at Faith Trust Institute. We're going to go ahead and get started today. We are joined by Reverend Al Miles, who will be presenting on medical chaplaincy, serving the victims of sexual and domestic violence. I will be introducing Reverend Miles in a moment, but first want to go over a few technical details. You should be able to hear me now through your computer or phone, as well as see the technical information slide on your screen. If you are having problems with the sound, please check that your speakers or headset are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. If you are having technical problems, I recommend you exit the webinar, return to the link in your email, and try to connect again. All audience members are muted. If you have questions or comments, you can submit them to me using the question feature on the right side of your screen. Our presenter, Al, is happy to take questions as they come up today, so please use the chat or the Q&A box to send me your questions at any time during the presentation. We will also reserve some time at the end of today's session for questions, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. If you don't see the question box, click on the small orange arrow on the right side of your screen to expand the features options. The slides that you see on your screen today during the presentation will be emailed to you as a PDF later this afternoon, so you'll have access to them as a resource. I'll also send a certificate of attendance. Lastly, we are recording this webinar to make it available on our website for those who can't join us for this live session. So welcome to those of you who are listening to this recording. Now I'm going to just talk a little bit about Al Miles. Reverend Al Miles is a board-certified chaplain and national trainer in adult and teen intimate partner violence awareness. He received his undergraduate degree from Anderson University and his Master's of Divinity degree at the Anderson School of Theology. Since 1993, Miles has worked for Pacific Health Ministry at the Queens Medical Center in Honolulu. He is an ethics consultant and chair of the hospital's ethics committee and serves as the coordinator of the hospital ministry department. He speaks frequently to nationwide audiences from a wide variety of fields on domestic and teen dating violence, child abuse awareness, and on establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries in professional relationships. Miles is the author of Domestic Violence, What Every Pastor Needs to Know, Violence in Families, What Every Christian Needs to Know, and Ending Violence in Teen Dating Relationships, a resource guide for parents and pastors. Reverend Miles has been an ordained minister in the Church of God since 1983. Before I pass this over to Al, we're going to take a quick poll to see who's here today. And so you should see a poll come up on your screen that says, what's your role? And so if you could just all take a second to fill that out. And just give it another minute. Okay, it looks like most people have voted, so I'm going to go ahead and show the results of that, and I'm going to pass it over to Al now.
Claire, thank you very much. And it's good to be with you and good to be with Faith Trust Institute. I've been asked to address medical chaplaincy and our role in addressing sexual and domestic violence. I think it's very important for us to start off with a definition, a working definition of what we're talking about. Maybe please have the next slide. Domestic violence, also known as adult intimate partner violence, is a pattern of abusive behavior in which a person uses coercion, deception, harassment, humiliation, manipulation, and/or force in order to establish and maintain power and control over that person's current or former intimate partner. I think it's important to sort of break that down to understand that we're talking about a pattern of abusive behavior. It's not about somebody snapping or somebody losing it or someone who has a mental illness or who has a drug or alcohol problem. It's an intentional pattern of behavior, and to control the person that they're intimate with an offender will use coercion and deception and harassment and humiliation, manipulation and force to basically get what they want when they want it. Next slide, please. The prevalence of domestic violence is such that males and females are violators and violated. It's important to note that females are far more likely to be victimized than are males. According to the American Medical Association, 2 million women in the United States are assaulted each year by an intimate partner. And according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, 25% of surveyed women say they have been raped and or physically assaulted by a current or former spouse or partner. Let me say a little bit more about that, because as I speak about these issues across the country, I get some pushback oftentimes from men saying, but you're making it seem like all men are violent, all men are abusive. And I say, actually, very few men violate their intimate partners. Most men are not violent towards anyone, but most of the violence perpetrated in intimate partnerships and violence perpetrated in other aspects is perpetrated by males. So it is something that we have to think about as men's violence, male violence upon women, upon children, upon each other. Next slide, please. The tactics that offenders use have no limits, actually. It usually starts off with what is known as emotional abuse tactics. The offender, the male offender, will start dictating to the female what she wears, what she can eat, how she dresses, even how she can attend worship or when she can attend worship, and the people that she can associate with. Emotional abuse tactics also include calling a victim survivor out of her name. And here we're not talking about calling her honey, sweetheart, or baby, but talking about vulgar names such as bitch and slut and whore. And these vulgarities are stated in a way that really does have a grave negative impact on the female victim survivor. Economic abuse occurs when the offender holds all the money or will divvy out the money to the victim survivor or will put her on an unrealistic type of allowance. One survivor said, I'm supposed to buy food for the entire family for the whole week, and he gives me $25, which we all know in this day and age is an impossible task. Another survivor said that though I made far more money than my husband made, I had to give every bit of my money, my checks every week to him, and I don't know what he did with the money. So it's control of the economics. Psychological battering causes a victim survivor to think that her offender has gone crazy because such things as throwing things, maybe not even intending to hit the victim survivor, but throwing things near the victim survivor's head, or punching walls, or breaking glass, or breaking heirlooms, or breaking plates. These kind of things have a tremendous negative effect on a victim survivor's psyche. Sexual abuse tactics not only involve forced sexual intercourse, but it also involves referring to a victim survivor in gross sexual names, calling her a boob or a cunt or other disturbing names and disrespectful names. It also involves forcing a victim survivor to do something sexually that she finds offensive, or trying to force her to have sex with another man or another woman, or with an object or with an animal. Physical abuse tactics a lot of times are identified by the sort of gross tactics, the severe beatings, the strangulations, the stabbings. A victim survivor here in Hawaii suffered third-degree burns by having acid thrown all over her. But physical abuse tactics also involve restraining a victim survivor, blocking her passage so that she can't leave when she wants to, holding a victim survivor in a way that confines her. And spiritual abuse tactics I want to spend more time on, especially for those of us who are clergy and other spiritual leaders joining the webinar. Spiritual abuse tactics involve the misuse of divine beings, God, Jesus, Allah, Muhammad, and other divine beings. It involves misusing doctrine. It involves misusing culture to support a hierarchical structure within a relationship. So instead of what's intended by the divine to have females and males as equal partners, in spiritual abuse tactics, it is said that men, just simply because of our gender, have headship and authority over our female intimate partners. It involves saying to a woman who says, "No, thank you, I decline to have sexual relationships with you." All of a sudden, it involves the man saying, "But according to the scripture, you have to have sex whenever I want to have sex." It involves teachings that say that a woman is not equal to a man simply because she's a woman or a female. So woman, girl is not equal to a boy or a man because they are females. So it's the misuse of that which is divine, which is sacred, which is holy, to claim that men have and males have power and authority over females. Next slide, please. These are some of the things that we talked about before, but let's go over them a little bit more in detail. A victim survivor is told what she can wear, her hairstyle, her hair length, her hair color. Victim survivors are told to whom they can and cannot relate, who they can and cannot speak to, what they can and cannot do or think. And as stated before, what they can and cannot study, when they can work, when they can go to worship. We talked about the discussing disrespectful names. And oftentimes victim survivors have told me over the past 3 decades that the physical violence was awful. The emotional, psychological, verbal abuse was even more scarring to my soul. The tactics also include threats made by the offenders to kill themselves, their victims, the victims' caregivers, families, friends, the victims' pets, as well as mentioned before, the destruction of items meaningful to victim survivors, particularly heirlooms given by people who meant something to the victim survivor, and the offenders will destroy those items. Next slide, please. Domestic violence occurs in every culture, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, race, religion, and in all socioeconomic classes. Oftentimes, it is misappropriated to think that domestic violence only occurs among the poor or among people of certain cultures or people of certain races. But it occurs, the scope of it is everywhere. Next slide. I'm often asked, what causes domestic violence? And the my response is that it's a conscious decision and a willful choice of of an offender to use abusive tactics. It's conscious. He knows what he's doing. He knows exactly what he's doing, and it's a choice. And it's very important, particularly those of us who are spiritual leaders, because a lot of times we will get men who say that she pushed me and pushed me and pushed me, or she's got a mouth on her, or she just nagged and nagged and nagged till I couldn't take it anymore. So we must remember that the problem is not caused by alcohol or other drugs, although oftentimes they coexist. Alcohol problem, drug problem, domestic violence. It is not caused by alcohol or drugs. Domestic violence is not caused by misbehaving children. It is not caused by job stress. It is not caused by psychological illness or pets or Satan. I want to stop there for a second because, again, in the religious world, oftentimes those of us who want to help, I'm talking about medical chaplains and other spiritual leaders, will be told by offenders that the reason that the offender did what he did was because Satan or some other evil force has taken control of him. That's just simply not true. Backing up a little bit more and talking about alcohol and other drugs, talking about job stress, talking about psychological illness, there are millions of people who are under job stress, who have psychological illnesses, who struggle with alcohol or drug addiction, who have children, who are stressed out from time to time and don't abuse their intimate partners, their pets, their property. They abuse no one. The actions and the behaviors of an offender are conscious and willful choices. The biggest blame, however, is placed upon a victim survivor herself. Oftentimes the offender will say the reason that he and sometimes she has abused their intimate partner is because of the behavior of the person being violated, and that is not true. It's a falsehood. Claire, I want to stop for a second to see if there's any questions before we move on.
Up until now, there's no questions, Al, that relate to what you've talked about yet, so we can hold off a little bit.
Okay, let's continue on. Next slide, please. What contributes to domestic violence? This is a question that is often asked, not only me, but other trainers in the field. Certainly, the contributing factors are how culture views females and males, family teachings about males and females in society, societal practices, once again, about males and females, the media. And when I say the media, it is not just what we see in movies and DVDs, on television, but what we see in print media as well. Looking at some of the popular magazines, it's very seldom that females are admired for their brains, for their reasoning. They are used as objects oftentimes for their bodies. There's a tape that I use oftentimes when I'm training, and in the tape there are two co-workers being addressed by their boss, their male boss. The male co-worker is told, "Tony, you did a wonderful job on that project that I gave you." Now the female co-worker was also on that project, but instead the boss says, "And Linda, I love that dress you're wearing today." When I show this in trainings, many times the audience at first says, "I don't see there's a problem." He said, "Tony, you did a wonderful job. Linda, you look nice today." And I said, "But the task of the workforce is for Linda and Tony to do their work, not to talk about the appearance and he's not complimenting Linda on her work, which is what she's hired for, not because she's got on a pretty dress. So oftentimes, it's this societal, cultural thing to objectify females, to not at all respect and to compliment women on their thinking and their reasoning and their hard work, but on their bodies. And religious teachings. Religious teachings, oftentimes from a Christian perspective, I am often told that the reason that men do what they do, the reason that they're the head of the household, the reason that they have all the money in the household, the reason that they can dictate where a woman goes and what she wears and how she thinks is because in the Christian scriptures, it states very clearly that wives should submit themselves to their husbands. Well, actually, in the scriptures, Ephesians 5:21 through 33, which is often cited for that reasoning, actually in Ephesians 5:21 through 33, when we study the text in its original language, the Greek, both husbands and wives are told to be responsible to each other. They are told to treat each other with mutual respect, with mutual love, with mutual worth, with mutual power and mutual understanding. It's not a hierarchical schema, but the way that it is presented by spiritual leaders oftentimes, wives, and for that matter, daughters, are told that they're second class simply because of who they are gender-wise. The other thing that we have to be mindful of with religious teaching, if we continue to use male pronouns for the divine, God as Father, use the terms Lord and King, it suggests once again that women do not match up, do not have the same kind of power and authority and privilege, are not granted the same unconditional love as our males. So what I constantly am requesting of spiritual leaders is to start using language such as God, humankind instead of mankind, sisterhood and brotherhood instead of just brotherhood. The more we do that, the more we see what is intended, which is the equality of the female and male, the equal love, the equal respect, and the equal responsibility. The other thing I want to say about Ephesians 5:21 through 33, 9 of the 12 verses in that passage by the author, some believe that the author is St. Paul, others don't know who the author is, but 9 of the 12 verses are what a husband must do. What keeps getting cited oftentimes is wives, submit yourselves to your husbands, because the husbands are the head of the household. So it's very important that we bring in the egalitarian nature of the scriptures, of God, of Jesus, and of all other divine beings. Next slide, please. Religious and faith questions that survivors often encounter are very common across the religious spectrum. Oftentimes, when a survivor goes to her spiritual leader or goes to a member of a congregation, she's asked questions such as, are you fully submitting to the God-given authority of your husband? Once again, that's projecting that a male has headship and a female must submit to the authority of this male headship. That is a teaching that keeps a woman in a position of subjugation and makes it easier for her to be misused. Another question that's very common that comes up from a religious context and from a Christian perspective, which is my perspective. Abused women are often asked, are you being a good Christian wife and mother? The emphasis being on good. Once again, the suggestion is that if a woman is a good Christian wife, a good mother, then she will not get abused by her husband. But that's not a good comparison at all, because the reality is the abuse that happens is the sole responsibility of the person committing the abuse. And if it's the husband committing the abuse, we should be asking questions about why would a good Christian man be abusing his wife or his children or his pets or property. The other question that's often asked from a religious faith perspective is, have you forgiven your husband or partner for the abuse that he's perpetrated against you? I tell the story that often happened earlier in my ministry, where a woman was preparing to go to church with her husband, who was the pastor of this Christian church. And so she handed her husband their toddler. And as what would happen a lot of times with little babies, the child threw up all over the husband. The husband immediately went over to the wife and began to beat her because she wasn't being a good Christian mother, because a good Christian mother would have made it somehow so that the child would not have threw up. But what happened next is even more arresting, because all of a sudden, realizing what he has done, that is beating his wife because a baby did what a baby will do, which is vomit from time to time, the husband then went to get a Bible and said that you have to forgive me right now. Forget what I've done, reconcile with me, and everything is going to be okay. And I ask audiences all the time, how could everything be okay in that situation? Simply because the wife was being asked to forgive the husband. Forgiveness often gets equated wrongly with forgetting. We want victims and survivors to actually remember the tactics used against them, so that when those tactics come up again, they will have some kind of knowledge, some notion of how to escape, or at least to judge these for being wrong, which they are. It's just unrealistic for anybody on this call who has gone through something that's been tragic. It doesn't even have to be abuse. It's unrealistic to all of a sudden say, well, just forgive and forget what happened to you. So we shouldn't be telling victim survivors to forgive and forget. Forgiveness also is wrongly often equated with reconciliation. Forgiveness from the Greek text is the process of releasing, of letting go, of putting aside. Reconciliation is to restore something that has been broken. So a victim survivor can choose in process, sometimes over a long period of time, to forgive the abuse that she suffered from her male intimate partner. But she can also choose at the same time to not reconcile, to restore that relationship, particularly if the offender is not doing anything to work on his injustice. Oftentimes, reconciliation is rushed through without the person repenting, turning away completely from the sins that were caused. The other thing that we hear from a Christian perspective a lot of times about this reconciliation and this quick forgiveness is that spiritual leaders and other people will say, then everything will be okay. So it's this thing that I often will say, that a victim survivor is told to stay and obey and pray, and then somehow though it's never fully explained how, somehow everything is going to be okay. As a result of this kind of faulty type of teaching, many victim survivors suffer even greater abuse, and tragically some have been murdered. When dealing with forgiveness, we must go on the time frame of a victim survivor. This could mean a process that goes on for years. We should not in any way rush a victim survivor to forgive her offender. In no way should we rush a victim survivor to reconcile, to restore a relationship wrecked by his abuse. And we must take caution to never suggest that if an offended woman decides to forgive, then somehow everything is going to be okay. The offender needs a lot of things that he has to work on before everything will be okay, and that takes a long, long time. Next slide, please. The role of medical chaplains, and I also know that we have social workers and other care providers on the call, but it's very important. We play a very important role as an active listener. Very important to listen to what the survivor is saying, how she's telling her story, the way she needs to tell her story. Once again, I want to talk to our sisters and brothers who are religious leaders. Oftentimes, she needs to tell her story, and she needs to tell it in the most crude way that it's happened to her, using the language that's been used against her, saying exactly what the man who claimed to love her told her. So if he called her a slut or a bitch or a whore, she may need to say that, and it's very important that we listen actively to what she tells instead of trying to correct her language. I say that because oftentimes survivors have told me they tried to tell their pastor, their priest, their rabbi, their story, and all of a sudden, when they use the language that's been used against them by their offenders, they've been corrected by the spiritual leader and said, oh, that language, please don't use that language. Well, it's not the victim survivor that we should be talking about with that. We need to be talking to the offender. The role of medical chaplains and other caregivers involves limit setting. It's important that we establish and maintain good boundaries. It's important that we don't go beyond the depth and breadth of our training, that we know that, okay, I can see this particular woman, or I can see this offender, and then I need to make referrals to people in the community who do this work as well. It's important that we don't try to all of a sudden foster relationships that may unintendedly foster a dependency upon us, either an emotional dependency, a psychological dependency, or even a sexual relationship, a sexual dependency. So limit setting is vital. We as caregivers need to be a safe haven. And by safe haven, I mean that we need to know and understand what confidentiality means, what we will and will not share with others. Do not go out. There was a chaplain, a medical chaplain, told things by a survivor. She had not told anybody else. And the medical chaplain then went out and just started to speak in the cafeteria to other caregivers. Fortunately, I overheard this and reminded him how important it was to not share. It needs to be safe, and the victim survivor can share what she needs to share, but we should not be sharing haphazardly things that we have been told. The role of medical chaplains and other caregivers is to be truth tellers. And part of that truth telling is to say that no one deserves to be abused and no one has a right to abuse anyone. Speaking at a national conference in front of 200 people a couple of years ago. All of a sudden, when I was talking about one survivor in that community who had told her story, and I said, we need to say no one deserves to be abused. I was challenged by a male spiritual leader who said, but what if the survivor has been sleeping with other men? What if the survivor has called him a bad name? What if the survivor has been drinking? And I said, as I'm going to say again and again and again until I die, no one deserves to be abused, and no one has a right to abuse anyone. If a survivor has an alcohol or drug problem, let's help her get help. Even if a survivor is sleeping all over town, her husband has a right to be upset, has a right to leave, has no right at all to abuse her in any way, shape, or form. We have to continue to have that message that no one deserves to be abused and no one has a right to abuse anyone. And I spoke earlier about being a referral agent. Once again, it's very important that we know our limits. Because I've worked at this agency, Pacific Health Ministry, at the Queens Medical Center for the past 23.5 years, many of the physicians and nurses and social workers and other people at the hospital, other care providers, know my role in domestic violence awareness. Some will want to see me ongoing, but I have to set the limit to say I am a referral agent. I am not qualified to provide counseling. I'm not qualified to see you on a regular basis or set up a shop as though I'm a counselor. Refer is very important. Claire, once again, I'm going to stop to see if there are any questions.
There are several questions that I can go ahead and ask you right now before you get to the next slide. One is in reference to the slide where you talked about Satan, and the questioner wants to know, how is the reference to Satan as the fault to the abusive behavior addressed? So if someone blames Satan for their behavior, how would you as a pastoral care provider respond to that?
I have responded. That's an excellent question. I've responded to that several times. It usually comes up when I'm talking to an offender or talking to another spiritual leader, and the spiritual leader says, well, the offender, told me that the reason that he has done what he's done to his wife, the reason he raped her, the reason he beat her, is because there's a power that takes over, Satan or some other evil force. And I will always address it by saying, but Pastor, when he's talking to you, when he's going to his job every day, when he's getting the key to the city for being the top salesperson, Satan never has a hold of him. Why is it that Satan only has a hold of him when we're holding him accountable for his crime and sin of domestic violence? When men talk to me who are offenders and say, it's really not me who called my wife a bitch, it's really not me who hurt my wife, it's something that's inside of me, and I'll say, there's something inside of you. How come you're not attacking me? When he's talking to me, he's very complacent, making sure that he has all of my titles, tells me how well I'm dressed. You're a scholar, you're this, you're that. When he's in front of the judge, he never talks about Satan, but all of a sudden when he's talking about his actions that we need to hold him accountable for. So I'm always saying to spiritual leaders to address the matter of Satan as an excuse. So he replaces the excuse of, I was drunk, I was on drugs, she came at me. He's not using his fist as a weapon. He's not using his penis as a weapon. Now he's using this idea that this evil being is taking him over. And that's another tactic and another excuse. And it's very important for us spiritual leaders to address that forthrightly and say that we need to hold you accountable, Bob, making up a name. We need to hold you fully accountable And using Satan sounds like an excuse. Or saying that you didn't know what came over, I must have a mental problem. Once again, millions of men and women have struggled with mental health, behavioral health issues who do not abuse anyone. And it's important that we don't let them use that as an excuse to say, it was Satan, it was the drug, it was something evil that took me over. Because rest assured, as I said before, when he's working day to day, when he's talking to other people, Satan never has a hold of him. So is this a come and go thing? And I'm suggesting very strongly that it's an excuse.
Thank you. And then just one other for now. What would you say to a victim survivor, an abuser, or even a clergy who believe that saving or preserving the covenant of marriage is more important than safety for the survivor?
Well, obviously I would differ with that. That comes up a lot, and I would differ with that. Oftentimes what we get is that situation where the victim survivor will go to the clergy person, and the clergy person will say, what is happening, what he's doing to you is wrong, but the marriage must be saved at all costs. And what I will ask the spiritual leaders, I said, what is more important, the so-called sanctity of the marriage covenant or the safety of a woman and her children? I've never had a clergy person say to me, the sanctity of the marriage covenant is more important. And I say, but it's suggested when you say that a marriage must be saved at all costs. So we need to work on that and say that when two people are mutually respectful and faithful and loving and responsible, then that sanctity of marriage is pretty strong. That bond is real strong. But when somebody has broken the covenant through violence, through adultery, through other forms of abuse, then we do not need to hold that woman into bondage in any kind of way. But yes, that is a major issue that comes up, that women will turn to their spiritual leaders, and the spiritual leaders will say, it's wrong what has happened to you, but you must stay in that marriage at all costs. And I will always say to those spiritual leaders, are you really saying that she should stay there unto death because his abuse is escalating? No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that marriage is sacred. And I said, I would agree when people are respectful and loving and faithful. But the covenant has been broken not by her action of trying to get away from the abuse. The covenant has been broken by his abusive behavior. And I think that we really need to take a look at that kind of teaching if we're teaching that the covenant is broken by a woman trying to get to safety and get her children to safety.
Thanks, Al. Those are the questions for now.
Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. Chaplains play a critical role in helping victim survivors and helping to hold accountable offenders. Here's certain practical steps that we need to take. We need to listen to and believe a victim survivor's story. Sometimes clergy will say, you know, that there's two people in this relationship. You know, it takes two to tangle. And I'll always say, we're not talking about a dance step right now, we're talking about abuse. But it's very important that what the survivor, the victim survivor, tells us, that we listen to that story and believe the story. If there are other things that need to be weeded out, let's let the people like attorneys and advocates and other people who are equally important in this process take those over. But for us, we need to listen and believe the victim's story. Even if we know Mike, and once again, I'm just making up a name, even if we know Mike and he's been a part of our church, we know Mike as a good co-worker in our role as medical chaplain, we know Mike as a friend or a neighbor, we oftentimes won't know what's going on in that home. And if Susan or Mary tells us the story, we need to listen to that story and believe the story. Practical step also is to make the safety of a victim survivor and her children the top priority. As mentioned just a few minutes ago with that second question, sometimes spiritual leaders and others will talk about keeping the family together at all costs, to save a marriage at all costs. But the top priority has to be the safety of everyone in that household. So the victim survivor, her children, pets, property, and a non-abusive male partner. It's very important that we keep the safety of victim survivors and children as the top priority. As mentioned earlier, we need to maintain healthy professional boundaries. A part of those healthy professional boundaries is to know when to make referrals to caregivers in the community who do this work, who specialize in the work of ending violence, who address sexual and domestic violence all the time. It's very important that we partner with them, not try to do it all alone. Let me say something else about that. In the chaplaincy field, in the medical chaplaincy field, we often have multidisciplinary teams. So working with our social workers, with the case managers, with other RNs, with APRNs, with physicians, we can work together, and as a collaborative team, we have a better chance of keeping a victim survivor safe and free from bondage. The next one, do not recommend or participate in couples or marriage counseling. I want to say something beyond that, though. If we don't have the proper licensing and degrees to be considered a counselor, we should not be counseling people. I've been doing the work in domestic violence awareness for 32 years. As Claire has stated earlier, I've written several books. I speak all the time on this issue. But I, Al Miles, am not qualified to be a counselor. I don't have the licensing, I don't have the degrees, I don't have the training to be a counselor. I'm excellent at making referrals to counselors. So I want to really press not only the medical chaplains and the other spiritual leaders on the call, but everybody listening. If we don't have the right credentialing, please don't set up a counseling service. Oftentimes victim survivors will say, I'm seeing Reverend so-and-so, Rabbi so-and-so, Imam so-and-so, and I'm always asking, what are their credentials to be considered a counselor? And oftentimes these men and women have no credentials, so it's very important that they make referrals. There's one thing from my own religious tradition that I definitely have a pet peeve about, and that is when a victim survivor says, I'm looking for Christian counseling. I don't mind a qualified MSW or PhD or THD person who has the counseling skills, who happens to also be Christian, to do counseling. But a lot of times that denotes that Christian counseling is some kind of specialized training, and it is not. And so again, brothers and sisters, if you don't have the credentials, please do not engage in marriage or couples counseling. Something that's not on the slide that's also very important: do not engage in any kind of counseling, couples counseling, spiritual care, couples meetings, or anything like that if abuse has occurred or abuse is suspected, because that's going to be very much danger for the victim survivor. So it's very important that we don't engage in counseling, but it's very important that we don't facilitate couples counseling, marriage counseling. Sometimes spiritual leaders have said, I do that to get at the truth, which once again implies that the victim survivor is not telling the truth. Our role is to listen, to believe, to make referrals, but do not set a victim survivor up by bringing her together with her offender, because it will be dangerous for her. We said a lot about seeking the proper education and training so that we can be partners with other caregivers in terms of stopping, addressing sexual and domestic violence. It's not a one-time thing, by the way, sisters and brothers. It's very important that we continue to take the trainings. Faith Trust Institute is an excellent place to take proper training, ongoing. And after all the years of service that I've been privileged to, every year I'm constantly reading the new material, the research, and attending conferences to keep my skills sharp. Work collaboratively with other spiritual leaders and professionals from healthcare and community disciplines. Very important to do that. If you're a medical chaplain, if you're in a healthcare institution, long-term care facility, please work with the sisters and brothers who are there with you. If you are a parish clergy person, it's very important to work in concert with the agencies in the area that are trained, the advocates and activists that are trained to work in domestic and sexual violence awareness response. Next slide, please. Some of the resources, and let me talk very quickly about the resources that are there. My books are available online, Amazon.com. Faith Trust has my books as well. Faith Trust has a wonderful resource in creating partnerships to end sexual violence in faith communities. Wonderful resource. They have a number of other resources at Faith Trust that are not listed. But speaking of recognizing and addressing domestic violence in Christian communities, you see the authors there. There's another excellent resource. And the hotlines and resources there are so vital. No one is expecting people on the call or those who are not on the call to know everything about domestic and sexual violence. It's very important that we have a working knowledge, that we work in teams, that we're willing to make referrals, that we're willing to listen to and believe a victim survivor, and that we're willing to hold fully and solely accountable the men and some of the women, some women who are abusive. It's very important that we hold the offenders accountable for what they're doing. Hopefully they can get the help they need. But one of the ways that we can do that is by making referrals and working in collaboration with community partners. Claire, how are we doing? Any questions?
We do have just a couple questions and just a couple of minutes for questions. So thanks, everyone. Don't forget that you can submit questions right now using the question box on the right side of your screen, and we will just get to as many as we can in the next 4 minutes. So one question is, as a medical chaplain in perhaps a hospital setting, if you are visiting someone who you think is in an abusive situation, but their family is present, is it appropriate as a chaplain to ask the family to leave so that you can talk to the patient alone?
I wouldn't ask the family to leave in that kind of situation. I would try to come back when the patient is alone. Most institutions, I'm talking about healthcare institutions, have visiting hours, and fortunately we chaplains fall outside of those visiting hours and we can go visit at any time. And I've had situations like that where it becomes clear that the person in the room with this particular woman who's the patient, the male in the room, I'm suspecting him as being the offender. And we talk about general, almost weather type things, and then I've gone back when I know he's not there, or he happens to mention when he's working, or outside of visitor hours, and then I'll say, you know, Mary, I was concerned the other day when I came to visit you. So no, I would not ask them to leave because that might raise even suspicions, especially if one of those family members is the suspected offender. He might think, okay, what is she or he going to talk about? And so I would come back at another time and make it timely. I certainly wouldn't wait days, but I would come back at another hour where it's where she's alone, and then have that conversation.
Thank you. And then another one is, given that you might only have one opportunity to talk to a victim survivor about the violence she is facing, what might be some of the most important things to say or ask her?
Yeah, okay, assuming that we're one-on-one with her, and you're right, sometimes we're only, especially with length of stays being shortened in healthcare facilities, we may have that one time. One of the residents in our program, it's interesting that question came up because one of the residents in our program had that one opportunity just a few days ago. And the important thing, what that resident did, had a course on domestic violence awareness that I teach all the chaplain residents. He knew to say that no one deserves to be abused. He knew to say to her, you don't deserve what's happening. I am concerned about your safety and well-being. I don't want to give you resources that he can find, that your offender can find, but instead, let me talk about some of the things here, talk about 911, but you don't deserve to be abused, and you did not cause this abuse. So he did a heck of a job in that short period of time with that sort of one-time thing. A lot can be accomplished in the one time because oftentimes victims and survivors have told me it was the medical chaplain, it was the hospice chaplain, it was the long-term care chaplain who listened and believed me that got me started to think about other resources in the community. So it's very important that we take the opportunity. But a great part of that is to believe the story, is to tell her that no one deserves to be abused and no one deserves to be an abuser, and tell her how much that you believe her and that you wish for her all the best.
Thank you so much, Al, and I think that that's all the time that we have for questions. And I just wanted to thank you again for sharing your time and insight and experiences on the importance of medical chaplaincy and serving the needs of victims and survivors of violence. I just want to point out a few things. On September 21st, we have our Meaningful Voices online book club, where we will be discussing trauma and recovery, and we're so excited to be joined by the author Judith Herman. We also have our next upcoming webinar is Thursday, September 15th, and it's on pastoral care issues, addressing the end-of-life needs of survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence by Reverend Dr. Sarah Reith. And you can also find out all about our upcoming webinars online at www.faithtrustinstitute.org. Once again, we really appreciate you being part of this conversation. So thank you for joining us, and this concludes today's presentation. I will email the presentation slides to you later this afternoon. Take care.